This video is about the Orion correlation theory and the forbidden subject. Greetings, my name is Stephen Myers and I am the founder of the Pharaoh's Pump Foundation. This YouTube video was created to discuss what may be the very last forbidden subject that exists. Yes, there is, in our modern age, here in the 21st century, a subject that seemingly cannot be discussed. This subject is so forbidden to discuss, it is not even allowed to discuss that the subject is forbidden to discuss. Wow. In fact, this subject is so forbidden to discuss, many people are blissfully unaware that the subject is forbidden to discuss, and when they find out what the forbidden subject is, they can't believe it is forbidden to discuss. That is, until I explain it to them. But guess what? Harley and I are going to discuss this forbidden subject anyway. Aren't we, Harley? Yeah, Harley is nodding his head. Yes, you are right, Harley. I, with the help of Harley, over there in the control booth, will, in this video, actually discuss what is the very last forbidden subject on Earth. Since Harley is in the control booth, if anything gets out of control, it's all Harley's fault. You don't worry about Harley. He can handle the pressure. This is going to be an exciting and provocative video, sure to edify those who have the courage to watch this video in its entirety. In this day and age, with television shows like Jerry Springer, you would think there is nothing left that could possibly be off limits to discuss. Other people on talk shows like Dr. Phil or even Dr. Oz have never once addressed this subject. People openly discuss practically everything on Facebook, including what they had to eat to their most intimate experiences. Yet, the utter lack of discussion of the forbidden subject testifies to the fact that the forbidden subject is forbidden. There is not one Facebook group dedicated to this subject. No book on earth has ever been written which focuses primarily on this forbidden subject. The reason for this is simple. The subject is forbidden. The purpose of this video is to accomplish three things. First, we are going to identify the forbidden subject associated with the Orion correlation theory. We are going to actually say out loud for all to hear what the forbidden subject actually is. Second, we are going to describe what happens when there is an attempt to discuss the forbidden subject. When trying to discuss or talk about the forbidden subject, a fascinating and predictable event occurs. This video will describe that event. And third, we will discuss why this forbidden subject associated with the Orion correlation theory is forbidden. Why this subject is forbidden is both important and has huge implications regarding the Orion correlation theory. At first, you won't believe what the last forbidden subject on Earth is, so I'm just going to tell you. The forbidden subject is, drum roll please. No, Harley, not a rim shot. Drum roll please. The forbidden subject is the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. Yes, I actually said out loud what the forbidden subject is. Maybe you don't believe it now, but if you watch the entire video, you will understand that the research method used by the Orion correlation theory is the last subject on Earth that is forbidden to discuss. You will also learn what happens when an attempt is made to discuss this forbidden subject. But most important of all, you will understand why the subject is forbidden and the dire implications this forbidden subject has on the Orion correlation theory. I am just a humble researcher, and at one time I was probably just like you, the viewer, and didn't even know that it is forbidden to discuss the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. I was unaware that this subject was off limits to analyze or even talk about. How would I know? Because no one was talking about the forbidden subject because it is forbidden. Yet, that is exactly what we are going to do right here in this video. Against all odds, and in spite of the opposition, we are going to actually discuss the forbidden subject. With my good friend Harley, this video will actually discuss this forbidden subject in depth for possibly the very first time ever. Wow, this is exciting. Harley, are you pumped up? Yes, Harley says he is pumped up, and so am I. So let's do this thing. I guess I am just like most people on Earth that have an interest in pyramids in general and an interest in the Great Pyramid in particular. Nothing wrong with that. I happen to be an avid reader, and I've read a bunch of books about pyramids. Unlike many modern day researchers encountered on Facebook or on internet forums, I do read books. The many books I have read present different ideas about pyramids in general, and also different ideas about the Great Pyramid. These books provide explanations of pyramids which often contradict each other, which is okay to me. I'm rather tolerant that way and willing to consider explanations of the direct physical evidence remaining on the Giza Plateau. But the focus of this video is that there is apparently a way or method to understand the Great Pyramid that focuses on what are called correlations. This correlation-driven method to understand the Great Pyramid has resulted in two distinct camps or two broad interpretations of the Great Pyramid, which both are based on correlation-focused understanding of the Great Pyramid. What those two distinct Great Pyramid correlation theories are will be addressed later. This correlation-driven method to understand the Great Pyramid has resulted in two broad camps, or two broad interpretations of the Great Pyramid, which both are based on a correlation-focused understanding of the Great Pyramid. What those two distinct Great Pyramid correlation theories are will be addressed later in this video, and we will examine each distinct Great Pyramid correlation theory in some detail. This video isn't about bad-mouthing the Orion correlation theory per se. Oh no, not at all. The production of this video is the result of the courage that Harley and I have demonstrated by actually discussing the issues surrounding the forbidden subject of research techniques associated with the Orion correlation theory. Isn't that right, Harley? Oh yeah, we have the courage to discuss the last forbidden subject, and we will examine that subject in regards to both the Orion correlation theory as well as the other rejected Great Pyramid correlation theory associated with the Great Pyramid. Simply put, we are going to discuss research techniques associated with both of these two distinct and contradictory Great Pyramid correlation theories. Like I said at first, I had no idea that the research techniques used to come up with Great Pyramid correlations was off limits to discuss. I have read all those Great Pyramid correlation books about Great Pyramid correlations with the speed of light, stars, cardinal directions, human anatomy, and so on. I know that modern people and contemporary book authors can and do conjure up gobs of Great Pyramid correlations without causation. In those books, there are correlations between the Great Pyramid and just about anything you could think of. These contrived Great Pyramid correlations were multiplying like flies on a turd. Everywhere I looked, someone was coming up with yet another Great Pyramid correlation. I was having more trouble with the proliferation of correlations than Captain Kirk had when he had trouble with tribbles. This ever-growing multitude of made-up Great Pyramid correlations seems to be woven into, what some would say, a convincing narrative or an explanation of the Great Pyramid's supposed esoteric purpose. Great Pyramid correlation proponents are often able to weave these correlations into a story that some have embraced. But for me, all this vast conglomeration of every conceivable correlation imaginable didn't seem like it was the whole story that needed to be told. There was an underlying issue that needed to be addressed that was the rest of the story. The ever-expanding proliferation of Great Pyramid correlations made up daily just created an apprehensive uneasiness within me. The greater number of correlations conceived resulted in more questions I had. The sheer number of correlations caused me to have some questions about these perceived correlations. It is okay to have questions. These questions are where my journey of discovery began, learning about the stark reality that the research methods used to come up with Great Pyramid correlations is absolutely forbidden to talk about. With all these zillions of Great Pyramid correlations, seemingly more are being conjured up every day, I wondered, can all of these conceived correlations be valid? Is such a thing even possible? Are 100% of the Great Pyramid correlations that people have come up with valid? I pondered this question. Can any or even one perceived Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? It is okay to wonder about that, or so I thought. So I searched for someone who believed the beloved Great Pyramid correlations without causation associated with the Orion correlation theory. These people are not hard to find. They are everywhere. They are swarming around like cockroaches all over the place. I found a Great Pyramid correlation believer and asked a question that, I didn't know at the time, was forbidden to ask. Also, when I asked the question, I didn't know why the question was forbidden, but it was. Here is the forbidden question that is both forbidden to ask and forbidden to answer. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? That single question led me to discover and identify what the last forbidden subject is, as well as what happens when that forbidden subject is discussed, and also why discussing the research methods of the Orion correlation theory is forbidden. This leads us to the second part of this video. The first part is identifying the forbidden subject. The forbidden subject is the research methods of the Orion correlation theory, which cannot be discussed. But we are going to discuss them anyway. Now we are at part 2, which is describing what happens when there is an attempt to discuss the forbidden subject. Then after that, in part 3, we will discuss why the research techniques of the Orion correlation theory is a forbidden subject. Although I didn't realize it at the time, when asking, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid, I had crossed some sort of a line that I was not supposed to cross. The Great Pyramid correlation believer acted stunned by my question and said to me, "You believe Great Pyramid correlations, don't you?" I thanked him for his response, even though he responded to my question with a question. So I asked again, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? With a cordial demeanor, he responded by telling me that there are profoundly significant correlations between the Great Pyramid and the cardinal directions and the speed of light and various stars and with mathematics and so on. When he finally finished, he was so proud of himself on how well he educated me about various Great Pyramid correlations and their perceived profound symbolic significance. I thanked him again, but doggedly asked, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? By then, things changed, and the Great Pyramid correlation believer lost his cordial demeanor and became frustrated and started getting hot under the collar. He became rather indignant, showing hostility towards me. At the time, I was clueless about what was going on under the surface, not knowing why my question elicited such aggressive behavior, but I have since found out. I couldn't understand at the time why he was agitated and couldn't provide a coherent answer to my seemingly simple question. I like coherent answers, maybe because when studying the Orion correlation theory, coherent answers are very rare. Hey, Harley, do you like coherent answers? He says he does. That's good to hear, Harley. Why couldn't the Great Pyramid correlation believer just answer my simple 7-word question? He seemingly couldn't say yes as an answer, but he also couldn't say no as an answer to the question either. The correlation believer thinks the correlations he just told me about are valid, but he can't provide an answer to, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? He couldn't say yes, and he couldn't say no. That struck me as being so strange that I needed to find out why he couldn't say either yes or no to my simple question. At the time, I thought his behavior made little sense, but after extensive research, I now understand why his response to my question was anger and hostility. He was not allowed to provide a coherent answer to my question. He could certainly respond to the question by yammering about a bunch of made-up correlations, but he could not provide a yes or no answer to the question. After I conducted extensive research, I found out why this is so. The reason he could not actually provide an answer to the question is because the question addresses the forbidden subject of the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory, and therefore it is forbidden to answer the question. As strange as it seems, this is true. The Great Pyramid correlation believer cannot answer yes or no to my question. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? This is because if he, or any Great Pyramid correlation believer, would provide a straightforward answer, either yes or no, they instinctively understand that my next question would be, how is a Great Pyramid correlation invalidated? That question, absolutely, positively, no matter what, must never ever be answered because the question addresses the forbidden subject associated with the Orion correlation theory. The research methods of the Orion correlation theory can never be discussed by anyone, especially Great Pyramid correlation believers. So the two questions, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid, and how is a Great Pyramid correlation invalidated, both address the forbidden subject of the research methods used in Great Pyramid correlation theories. Neither question can be answered, and both questions elicit anger and frustration from Great Pyramid correlation believers. They will always respond by talking about correlations or offer some convoluted verbiage, but they will never give a straight up answer to questions that address the forbidden subject. Just responding with verbiage after a question is asked is not necessarily answering the question. When forced or compelled to actually answer these two questions, their response will be frustration, then anger, and then blatant hostility. So I asked the Great Pyramid correlation believer another question. This question profoundly confirms that it is absolutely forbidden to discuss the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. I asked the following question to a Great Pyramid correlation believer who actually contends that Great Pyramid correlations are valid. This question is even more poignant than either of the first two questions I asked earlier. Here is the question. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? Great Pyramid correlation believers who contend that Great Pyramid correlations are valid cannot answer that question. Yes, it's true. They can't answer the question. Even though they think Great Pyramid correlations are valid, they cannot say yes to answer the question, or say no for that matter. This is because the question addresses the forbidden subject of research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. They cannot say yes or no to answer the question because they instinctively know that the next question would be, how is a Great Pyramid correlation validated? Questions that address research methods cannot be addressed by believers of the Orion correlation theory. Therefore, they cannot answer yes when asked, can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? Unbelievable as it seems, it is true. Of course, there will always be a response with rambling verbiage, debating ploys, But there will not be a coherent answer to both of these two additional questions. Again, these additional questions are, can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? And how is a Great Pyramid correlation validated? It is forbidden to answer either of these two questions because the questions address the forbidden subject of research methods associated by the Orion correlation theory. All I did was ask four seemingly simple questions and expected answers. Then all hell broke loose. The response to the questions was frustration, hostility, and anger. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers indignantly respond by saying, "Don't you believe Great Pyramid correlations?" Or they hurl insults. Then they refer me to a book to read or to a book author so I can ask the expert. I have conducted this experiment many, many times, and I was initially puzzled by the bizarre responses I get from Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers. So I conducted this same experiment over and over, interacting with large numbers of various Great Pyramid correlation believers, asking those same types of questions. These four questions, as well as other straightforward questions, constantly produced the same results. Always, 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 when they were finally compelled to actually answer any one of those questions, the same response was always forthcoming. They responded with frustration, then anger, and then blatant hostility. I realized that something was going on, something important, and something that needed to be understood. It is like having a mathematician say he discovered a new equation, but we are not allowed to know how that equation was validated. Even in high school math class, the teacher required students to show their work. Imagine a chemist saying he created a new formula, but we are not allowed to examine or even discuss the process used by the chemist to create the new formula. It is unimaginable. Yet, that is exactly how it is when dealing with the Orion correlation theory. We are not allowed to know or examine or even discuss the process in which they make their findings. It is important to point out the Great Pyramid is not the only area of study that uses correlations as a method to gain understanding. A correlation is a mutual relationship or causal connection between two or more things. Correlations, as a research tool, are a prevalent scholarly means of inquiry in all fields of study and in every endeavor of scientific analysis. So, I did some research on correlations in particular, and I also researched both valid and invalid research methods. Then I talked to a very special category of legitimate academic scholars. This category is known for avoiding invalid research methods and utilizing legitimate academic research techniques. The category of scholars I chose to find out about research methods was, drumroll please, Harley. Drumroll please. Researchers who don't care at all about the Great Pyramid. These scholars were of different fields of study, yet I asked each of them this same question: can a perceived correlation in your particular field of study be invalid? I was amazed by the very similar responses that I received from all of these scholars who don't care at all about the Great Pyramid. All of these highly trained scholars, scientists, and researchers simply and openly said, yes, correlations can be invalid. They told me how poorly conceived correlations can be the result of using poor research methods, resulting in the production of contrived correlations that are in reality just logical fallacies. These scholars of various fields of study all seem to tell me that even though a correlation may be perceived, that doesn't even imply a causation. When the word causation was mentioned, I would always ask what that word means, just to see what type of response I would get. Essentially, I was told by these professionally trained scholars who don't care about the Great Pyramid the very same thing about causation. They tell me that causation is some type of relevant, verifiable evidence that establishes a link or relationship or causality between the two things being compared in the correlation. I was often told that a correlation can be perceived, but that does not even imply a causation. They said that it is imperative to guard against perceived correlations that have no causation because embracing poorly conceived correlations with no evidence for causality between the things being compared in the correlation leads to logical fallacies and falsehoods. Wow, that doesn't sound very good when that happens. It was awesome having conversations with professional scholars who are trained to understand the distinction between invalid and valid research techniques. Their straightforward and coherent answers were a refreshing alternative to the answers provided by Great Pyramid correlation believers. These professional and trained scholars who don't care at all about the Great Pyramid tell me that there are two main types of correlations. These two types are correlations that are valid and correlations that are invalid. These scholars calmly told me that they must always guard against invalid correlations, and they are trained extensively in the use of valid scholarly research techniques. This professional training keeps these trained scholars who don't care at all about the Great Pyramid from using poor research methods that produce logical fallacies. I was fascinated learning from calm, cool-headed professional researchers who actively study research methods to improve their ability to conduct research. It was awesome to hear them identify and discuss valid scholarly research techniques they use and contrast that to unacceptable research methods they avoid. I have had many interesting conversations with this fascinating category of seasoned and trained scholars who have no interest at all in the Great Pyramid. Equipped with the knowledge I received from trained scholars, I set out to learn more about why asking Great Pyramid correlation believers about their research techniques stirs up so much anger and aggressive behavior. I wanted to know why Great Pyramid correlation believers were triggered by the subject of research techniques. So I came up with this experiment. This experiment is fascinating, and you won't believe the results it produces. That is, until you try it yourself. I found a Great Pyramid correlation believer who thinks that the made-up correlations associated with the Orion correlation theory are valid. I asked him the 4 questions shown on the screen. These 4 questions are: can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? How is a Great Pyramid correlation invalidated? Can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? How is a Great Pyramid correlation validated? I was amazed by the responses. In a perverse way, it was fun to watch Great Pyramid causation believers being overwhelmed by these simple questions that address the forbidden subject. As astonishing as it seems, they are unable to either say yes, a Great Pyramid correlation can be valid, and they are also unable to say no, a Great Pyramid correlation cannot be valid. And they will never allow a discussion of how a Great Pyramid correlation is validated or invalidated. Instead, in this experiment, the Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers will always respond by yammering away about correlations or referring me to an expert or author, but they would not and could not answer my 4 questions. All of the subjects in the experiment believed Great Pyramid correlations are valid, but they are not allowed to say they are valid. I was originally flabbergasted that Great Pyramid correlation believers cannot answer the question about Great Pyramid correlation validity with either a yes or no. But I now understand why they are not allowed to say yes to the question. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? To actually answer that question would open the door to discuss the research methods used to validate a Great Pyramid correlation that the Great Pyramid correlation without causation believer actually thinks is valid. But answering the question would result in talking about research methods, and that is absolutely forbidden. I have often repeated the experiment and asked various Great Pyramid correlation believers those questions, knowing that I will not get an answer. I found out that when I compel the subject in the experiment for an actual answer to the question, a predictable result occurs. He becomes frustrated, then upset, and then argumentative. After that, the subject in the experiment exhibits anger. To answer the questions that I am asking would require discussing the research techniques used to come up with the plethora of Great Pyramid correlations that he himself thinks are valid. Because I was addressing the forbidden subject, all he could do was get hot under the collar, agitated, and aggressive instead of engaging in open-minded dialogue. How interesting it is to me that someone who believes Great Pyramid correlations are valid is unable to say Great Pyramid correlations are valid or say how Great Pyramid correlations are somehow validated. This is because if he does, the direction of the conversation turns away from discussing made-up fake Great Pyramid correlations to the subject of research methods used to come up with fake Great Pyramid correlations. But that is a forbidden subject. I have done this experiment with many Great Pyramid correlation believers, always producing the same result. I continue my experiment by asking this additional question. What is the difference between an invalid research technique and a valid research technique? No coherent response to that question is ever forthcoming from a Great Pyramid correlation believer. Answering that question would address research methods, and we all know that is a forbidden subject. What a contrast it is asking that same question to legitimate academic scholars who are trained in the use of valid research methods and who are also trained to identify and avoid invalid research methods. Those people have no problem at all discussing the difference between valid and invalid research techniques. Great Pyramid correlation believers cannot directly respond to any question that would address the forbidden subject of research techniques. They will not answer that question or give any examples of valid research methods and contrast them to invalid research methods. To do so is not allowed because the subject is forbidden. So I ask yet another question. Is there such a thing as poor research techniques or a low standard of evidence? No coherent answer will be forthcoming. The only response will be anger and aggression. Unlike real researchers and scholars, Great Pyramid correlation believers cannot discuss the merits of various types of research techniques and identify poor research methods that should be avoided. So I ask yet another question. Is there such a thing as valid research techniques or high standards of evidence? Again, no coherent answer will be forthcoming, only a response of anger, hostility, and aggression. To say there are valid research techniques would invite a discussion about research techniques related to Great Pyramid correlations, but Great Pyramid correlation believers cannot have that discussion because it is a forbidden subject. So, my experiment is fascinating and produces predictable results. The reason for this has become obvious. I've come to understand that people who are Great Pyramid correlation believers are willfully ignorant as to the processes used in conducting valid research, They cannot identify or distinguish between a valid research technique or an invalid research technique. They are intentionally unaware of the distinctions between high standards of evidence and low standards of evidence. They can't even say there are valid research methods as well as invalid research methods. Yet it is surprising just who contends it is important to understand the difference between high and low standards of evidence. I think this quote from this guy is quite interesting, and the quote has far reaching implications. In this quote, he acknowledges that there are high standards of evidence that should be embraced, and there are low standards of evidence that should be avoided. Yet, my experience is that with Great Pyramid correlation believers, these are the things that they do not know about because it is in the realm of the forbidden subject. Authors of Great Pyramid correlation books have provided a terrible disservice to their readers. Great Pyramid correlation without causation book authors have done a horrible job in educating their readers about the difference between high and low standards of evidence. Great Pyramid correlation book authors will never provide any information about valid research techniques. The reason this disservice has been done to readers by authors who are proponents of Great Pyramid correlations is because informing their readers about research techniques is not allowed because it is a forbidden subject. Why it is a forbidden subject will be discussed later in this video. There are so many additional questions that I can and have asked Great Pyramid correlation believers that they are not allowed to answer because the questions address the forbidden subject. Instead of providing even more examples of questions that are not allowed to be answered, we will move on to part 3 of this video. So far, we have identified the forbidden subject associated with the Orion correlation theory and all other Great Pyramid correlation theories. That forbidden subject is the research methods used to come up with Great Pyramid correlations. We have also identified what happens when there is an attempt to discuss the forbidden subject of research techniques associated with the Orion correlation theory. What happens is hostility and anger is exhibited by Great Pyramid correlation believers who are triggered by the attempt to discuss the forbidden subject. We know what the forbidden subject is and what happens when there is an attempt to discuss the forbidden subject. But now the question becomes why. That is the third part of this video. The first part is what the forbidden subject is. The second part is what happens when there is an attempt to discuss the forbidden subject. We know that there is an aggressively angry reaction to trying to talk about the forbidden subject. But now we must understand why it is a forbidden subject. Why would Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers absolutely refuse to allow any discussion about the forbidden subject of research techniques? What makes Great Pyramid correlation believers so vastly different than actual trained scholars and educated researchers who don't care at all about the Great Pyramid? Let me make this clear. When I say research techniques, I use a rather broad and very inclusive definition of that term. When I say research techniques, I don't limit that term to mean empirical collection procedures. No, research techniques is much more than that. Instead of that narrow and limiting definition, I include any activity that a researcher conducts or participates in that relates to conducting research. If a researcher uses a faulty interpretation of evidence or uses illogical reasoning processes as a method or way to conduct research, then I would consider those methods, flawed as they are, to be research methods that the researchers use to conduct research. So my broad definition of research methods includes any data gathering method or data analysis method or reasoning process as a research technique. I think that if a researcher refuses to read a book, then that is a research method he is using. If a researcher doesn't get adequate sleep or proper nutrition while conducting research, then those activities, which have an effect on his researching abilities, are part of his research methods. If a researcher gets drunk or high during research, or simply believes what he has read in a Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation book, then those activities are research methods. So my definition of research methods is very broad and inclusive, and that is how it should be. This broad definition I am using keeps me from falling into the trap of debating the hair-splitting minutiae of the relative merits of either a widely inclusive or narrowly restrictive definition of the term research techniques. Sometimes nitpickers will come out of the woodwork and try to engage me in a mind-numbing, convoluted, unending, and useless debate on the meaning of the term research technique as a weapon to keep from actually discussing research techniques. We're not doing that here. What, Harley? Harley says he's glad we got that out of the way to satisfy the pathological nitpickers out there. Yes, Harley. So am I. So we know that we know what the forbidden subject is, and we know what happens when Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation believers are faced with discussing the forbidden subject. These folks are triggered when an attempt is made to talk about the forbidden subject. Now that we have provided our broad definition of the term research technique, we will now discuss why Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation believers are triggered when an attempt is made to discuss the forbidden subject. Now we will discuss what those unacceptable research techniques are, which are the modus operandi embraced by the Orion correlation theory. Wow, this is fun. I like discussing the forbidden subject of the flawed research techniques used by Great Pyramid correlation believers to come up with the contrived and fake correlations they embrace. Once we discuss those flawed research methods, you too will know why it is imperative to Great Pyramid correlation believers that they never ever allow a discussion of this forbidden subject. Harley, silence your phone. We're taping here in Studio B at the Pharaoh's Pump Foundation. What, Harley? We have a caller? Tell the caller to call back. We are busy taping live. Studio A is where we produce our documentaries. We have produced 2 documentaries about the Great Pyramid. The first documentary is how the Great Pyramid was built, and the second documentary is about why it was built. Both documentaries are available as DVDs from Amazon.com. What, Harley? The caller wants to be on the show? We are just taping a YouTube video. Can such a thing even be possible, even when we tape live? Evidently, it is possible because Harley says we have a caller. I try to make myself available to the general public, and that is why I have done over 130 radio talk shows discussing my research and books about the Great Pyramid. I also discuss the flawed research methods of the Orion correlation theory during the interviews as well. It is a hot topic right now. If you need a guest for your radio show, contact me through our website. Okay, Harley, patch him into my phone. What? It's a video call? The wonders of technology. Okay, put him on the screen. Here it comes. Thanks, Harley. Thank you for calling in. Do you have something to say about the forbidden subject of research techniques associated with the Orion correlation theory?
Stop talking about research methods of the Orion correlation theory. You know that is a forbidden subject. Don't even say research methods. You are not allowed to talk about how Great Pyramid correlations are made up. You are just supposed to believe Great Pyramid correlations without causation made up by modern people. This forbidden subject can never be discussed. Stop, stop, stop talking about research methods.
Harley, the caller is out of control. She doesn't want to allow any discussion of the forbidden subject associated with the Orion correlation theory. But the sad reality is, this is a typical response I get when I try to discuss the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory with the Great Pyramid correlation believers. But we will prevail, and we are going to discuss why the subject is forbidden. We will not allow Great Pyramid correlation believers to censor us and keep us from discussing the forbidden subject. Okay, where were we before the caller interrupted us taping this YouTube video? To provide a typical response from a Great Pyramid correlation believer. Oh yes, we are now going to actually discuss why there is such a negative reaction when trying to discuss the forbidden subject of research techniques associated with the Orion correlation theory. This leads us to part 3 of this video. Part 1 was identifying the last forbidden subject on Earth, which is discussing the research methods of the Orion correlation theory. Part 2 was describing the reaction Great Pyramid correlation believers exhibit when confronted with an attempt to discuss the forbidden subject of research methods. Now we will proceed to part 3 and examine why discussing the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory is forbidden. The reason why this forbidden subject of research techniques used by the Orion correlation theory cannot be discussed is because if it was ever allowed to discuss the research techniques of the Orion correlation theory, it would shed light on the stupendously poor research methods used by modern people who make up Great Pyramid correlations. The reason why the subject is forbidden is not allowing a discussion of the poor research methods of the Orion correlation theory is a way to try to protect the flawed results of the poor research methods which produce invalid Great Pyramid correlations. Not allowing a discussion of the research methods is an attempt to protect the flawed results of those research methods. So let's actually discuss the flawed research methods of the Orion correlation theory to see why discussing this subject is forbidden. Remember, the Great Pyramid has been the subject of 2 competing and distinct Great Pyramid correlation theories. The first of these theories, that centers around made-up Great Pyramid correlations without causation, is the rejected theory of pyramidology. This rejected and disgraced correlation theory compares the Great Pyramid with the Bible, conjuring up many precise correlations between the Great Pyramid and the Holy Bible. These correlations have to do with the so-called Pyramid Inch, birthplace of Jesus, Bible prophecy, and other religious biblical stuff. But ultimately, this biblical correlation theory has been rejected because the flawed, conjured up correlations were derived using very poor research methods. Those poor research methods of pyramidology are the exact same poor research methods the other Great Pyramid correlation theory, known as the Orion correlation theory, also uses. So let's get down to brass tacks and discuss those flawed research methods Great Pyramid correlation believers who embrace either the biblical correlation theory or the Orion correlation theory use the poor research techniques of cherry picking. Both Great Pyramid correlation theories cherry pick unrelated data points and then manipulate the data to come up with some sort of a perceived correlation. The correlation may be between the Great Pyramid and stars, or cardinal directions, or the Bible or human anatomy or whatever, and then simply declare an edict proclaiming, Shazam! It's a correlation. Here is something to consider when acknowledging that cherry picking as a poor research method is used to come up with Great Pyramid correlations without causation. Ask a Great Pyramid correlation believer what the Great Pyramid cannot be compared to come up with a correlation. When faced with that question, the Great Pyramid correlation without causation believer looks like a deer in the headlights. The reality is that the Orion correlation theory is the most grotesque and grandiose example of cherry picking ever conceived by the human mind. The question arises, how do we know the two cherry picked data points being compared are either related or unrelated? That is an easy question for legitimate academic researchers trained in valid research techniques. It is the duty and responsibility of the people comparing these two things to establish that the two things being compared in the correlation have a causal relationship. The two or more things being compared must include some form of additional, independent, relevant evidence indicating that the things being compared are related, which would give them causality. Scholars who are well versed and trained in research techniques call the additional piece of evidence causation, which indicates the two things being compared have some sort of intended relationship instead of just being unrelated data points cherry picked to make up a perceived but invalid Great Pyramid correlation. You may or may not know this, but Great Pyramid correlations of both the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory are notorious for not having causation. Let me say this again. Great Pyramid correlations from both of these poorly conceived Great Pyramid correlation theories are known for not having causation. If you don't believe me, ask somebody who believes Great Pyramid correlations that have been conjured up by modern people. Ask them what is the causation indicating the things being compared in the correlation have some sort of relationship instead of just being random data points. You will not get a coherent answer about that from a Great Pyramid correlation believer because the question addresses research techniques, and that is a forbidden subject. This is true for the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory. When you ask a Great Pyramid correlation believer about causation, their eyes glaze over. My experience is that Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers, Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers don't even pretend Great Pyramid correlations have causation. But again, they don't talk about this because research techniques is a forbidden subject. So the research technique of choice for Great Pyramid correlation believers is to simply use the logical fallacy of cherry picking to compare two things that have no causal relationship and declare there is a correlation between the cherry picked data points. Here is another poor research method used in both the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory. Oftentimes, the unrelated data points that are compared to make up a correlation without causation are somehow validated numerically. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers somehow think that math or numbers somehow validates a correlation without causation. In other words, if a mathematical number of one thing is perceived to coincide with or correspond with the math or a number of the other unrelated thing being compared, then the Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers declare the edict. Shazam! It's a correlation. Yet, in the realm of legitimate academic research, math does not validate a correlation. Having the same number in each of the two things being compared does not validate a correlation. Here is an example of how precise math does not validate a correlation. A micrometer turns 40 times to travel 1 inch. The Israelites were in the desert for 40 years. Shazam! It's a correlation. Yes, the number 40 is in both things being compared, but there is no causation between the two things being compared. So the correlation is false and simply the result of invalid research methods. Just because the same number is in both things being compared doesn't mean there is some significance or intended relationship between a micrometer and the number of years Israelites were in the desert. My car in the garage has 4 wheels, and the Great Pyramid has 4 sides. Shazam! It's a correlation. There is a mathematical correlation between the car and the Great Pyramid, but was that mathematically precise correlation without causation intended to be significant by the builders of the Great Pyramid? No. Even though 4 is a number associated with both of the things being compared, there was no causation between the two things being compared. So the perceived correlation is false and simply the result of invalid research methods. There is an assertion that there is a correlation between the Great Pyramid and the speed of light because supposedly the numbers match up. But like the other invalid correlations, that correlation has no causation. There is no evidence specific to the Great Pyramid indicating the builders intended any relationship between the Great Pyramid and the speed of light. Depending on what unit of measure is used, the numbers don't even match up. This graphic illustrates that concept. So, does using a different unit of measure mean there is no correlation between the Great Pyramid and the speed of light? Fiddling with the numbers and fiddling with the unit of measure and coming up with a number that you want to come up with and comparing that number with something else with a similar number is a very poor research method. That is why Great Pyramid correlation believers won't allow a discussion of research methods. They want to protect their flawed research methods that produce flawed results that they embrace. Here's an alternative explanation of the Great Pyramid's coordinates. The builders were trying to tell us the number of days in a year and got it wrong. That correlation that I just made up has no causation either. Based on the evidence of comparing two unrelated things without causation, Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers can come up with any interpretation they want. That is the grand advantage of using poor research techniques. My interpretation of the correlation between the Great Pyramid coordinates and the number of days in a year is just as logical as contending the Great Pyramid speed of light correlation without causation was somehow intended by the builders. There was no causation for either made-up fake correlation. People ask me how I know the builders were comparing the Great Pyramid with the number of days in a year instead of the speed of light. With no causation to tie together the two things being compared with each other, we can compare anything with anything. But the Great Pyramid correlation believers erroneously contend if the correlation seems to be substantiated with math, it must be valid. Yet, in the realm of the legitimate research, math does not validate a correlation. If you don't believe me, ask the special type of researcher who does not care about pyramids. They will explain it to you. Yes, it is true that neither math nor precision validate a correlation in the realm of legitimate academic study. This next question will help you understand why neither math nor precision validate correlations. This is just another question Great Pyramid correlation believers won't answer because it addresses the forbidden subject. Does precision validate a Great Pyramid correlation? When Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers are asked that question, and they know they are going to be compelled to actually provide an answer, they will not answer the question. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers cannot answer the question, does precision validate a Great Pyramid correlation? This is because the subject matter of that question addresses research techniques, and they are not going to talk about research techniques because that is a forbidden subject. In stark contrast, it is fascinating to know that in the realm of legitimate academic research, precision and math do not validate a correlation. Again, precision and math do not validate a correlation. There are a lot of correlations that are very precise but are invalid. These precise correlations are invalid because the two things being compared in the correlation have no causation. The things being compared are just unrelated data points that have been cherry-picked and compared without any justification. The two things being compared are not related. If you think some sort of perceived precision or math validates a perceived correlation, then you are using an invalid research method and you think that the correlations in the link below are valid. The link below is for a website called Spurious Correlations. It is just one of many awesome websites available to help people understand that neither math nor precision validate a correlation. The website has a bunch of correlations that are precise with impeccable math, but are invalid. These precise correlations include the number of people who drowned in pools compared with the number of films Nicolas Cage has been in. Yet that correlation is in reality invalid. It is just two random data points being compared. Also, if you think that math or precision validate a correlation, you would believe in the validity of the correlation between autism and organic food. You can see it as a precise mathematical correlation. Do you think that the precision or the math validates the perceived correlation between autism and organic food? All of these correlations have fancy graphs, but does precision or math or graphs validate the correlations? We don't want to forget the correlation between margarine and divorce. Does precision and math validate the perceived correlation between margarine and divorce? The link has many, many correlations that are precise but are also invalid. I hope you visit the Spurious Correlations website. It will be an education for you. In fact, it is safe to say that all invalid correlations are precise. Isn't that amazing? You won't learn that from reading Great Pyramid Correlation Without Causation books. Those books deprive readers from learning about valid research methods. So if you believe Great Pyramid correlations, the question on the screen is difficult to answer. If you answer yes, you are using invalid research methods. Both the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory contend that if something points to something, then that indicates the correlation was intended and somehow significant. Yet, in the real world, even if something points to something else, it doesn't mean it was intended to be significant. To validate some perceived correlation of something pointing to something else, causation would be very helpful. Yet, there is no feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any perceived correlation to have any significance. There is nothing about the Great Pyramid itself which indicates the builders intended the made-up, mathematically precise but fake Great Pyramid correlations perceived by modern people were intended to be significant or valid. What now, Harley? You have breaking news? Do we have to deal with it now? We are filming here. Okay, what is it, Harley? Harley says all hydroelectric dams have passages that point to stars. Shazam! It's a correlation. But even though hydroelectric dams have passages that precisely point to stars, does that mean the builders of the hydroelectric dams intended those precise correlations to be significant or meaningful? Well, there is no causation to validate the precise correlation of hydroelectric dam passages pointing to stars. Plus, when you add the variable of the precession of the equinoxes, the passages in dams, and the Great Pyramid can point to many stars or will point to other stars. So, with all of these cherry picked data points, and with the additional variable of the precession of the equinoxes, a passage in a hydroelectric dam can precisely point to hundreds of stars. This is also true when the vents in the Great Pyramid. These vents can and have and will point precisely to hundreds of different stars. How precisely something points to something else is a very poor research method to validate a Great Pyramid correlation without causation. If you think precision validates a Great Pyramid correlation, then you think the very precise Bible Great Pyramid correlations about prophecy and Jesus are valid because they are very precise. Anyway, back to the vents. Are any of the vents of the Great Pyramid pointing precisely to Orion right now? You wouldn't believe it, but there is a high percentage of Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers who think the answer to that question is yes. But the reality is that no vent of the Great Pyramid is pointing even close to Orion. Because of the precession of the equinoxes, the sky moves about 1 degree every 72 years. So, in the last 4,500 years, the vent that was supposed to point to Orion is now pointing about 62 degrees away from Orion. Wow, that's not a very precise correlation at all. Are the vents of the Great Pyramid pointing precisely to other stars right now? Yes, they are. Does that precision alignment validate the correlation between the vents of the Great Pyramid and the stars the vents are pointing to right now? Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers respond by asking, what stars are the vents pointing to now? Doesn't matter. There are lots of stars in the sky, and the vents are pointing precisely to stars right now. Does precision validate those contemporary precise star correlations? Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers say, well, you got to go back to when the vents pointed to the special stars, and that's when the precision validates a correlation, but the precision star vent correlations that actually exist now are not significant even though they are precise. I ask, is there a feature or evidence specific to the Great Pyramid which provides causation for the assertion that the significant time has to be way back when the vents happen to point to the stars, to those supposedly special stars? But unfortunately, when asking about causation or even asking about evidence, you're not going to get a coherent answer from Great Pyramid correlation believers because those questions address research techniques, and as we know, that is a forbidden subject. But they will again tell you that you have to go back to a specific time when the special stars lined up precisely and the precision validated the correlation with the special stars, even though there is no causation. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers say this is true even though there is no Great Pyramid feature or evidence that the builders intended any relationship between the Great Pyramid and any stars. What Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers are doing is using the additional invalid research technique of circular reasoning, which produces logical fallacies, instead of valid correlations. Both the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory love to use circular reasoning. Here is a quote from the book Stargate Conspiracy discussing the flawed circular reasoning used by Robert Bauval to somehow justify Great Pyramid star alignments. Quote, however, some of Bauval's assumptions are open to question. For example, he presents a very circular argument that uses the stellar alignments of the shafts to prove the date of the Great Pyramid, but also relies on this date to prove that the shafts have stellar alignments. This is classic circular reasoning, unquote. Here is another piece of information that is helpful to understand. There is no evidence or feature particular to the Great Pyramid, which indicates the builders intended anything on the Great Pyramid to point to something. In contrast, in the realm of legitimate academic research, if you see a correlation that is precise, it means nothing. I'll say it again. In the realm of legitimate academic research, if you see a correlation that is precise, it means absolutely nothing. This is because legitimate academic researchers know that a correlation, even a precise correlation, that happens to be perceived, doesn't even imply a causation. A mathematically precise correlation between the Great Pyramid and the speed of light means nothing in and of itself. That perceived correlation is only validated if there is applicable evidence of valid causation between those two specific things being compared. Just so you know, there is no relevant evidence for causation between the Great Pyramid and the speed of light except unrelated cherry-picked data points. What Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers do is cherry-pick unrelated data points and use circular reasoning and then declare an edict that, shazam, it's a correlation. They wrongly think that a correlation is validated either by precision, math, or some sort of a precise alignment. None of these things validate a correlation in the real world. But they don't stop there. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers will use a host of debating ploys as a way to bolster their frail logical fallacies. This includes the logical fallacy of appealing to authority. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers are overwhelmed when trying to discuss issues involving research techniques, so they say, haven't you read the books by this author or that author who write books about Great Pyramid correlations without causation? Or they suggest I talk to authors who are Great Pyramid correlation without causation believing gurus. Relying on the logical fallacy of appealing to authority as a debating tool to somehow protect invalid Great Pyramid correlations without causation is an unacceptable research method. This is fun discussing the forbidden subject of the tragically flawed research methods used by the Orion correlation theory, but we have just scratched the surface. Shall we keep going, Harley? Okay, Harley. If you are up to it, so am I. We will cover some more of the extremely poor research techniques used to come up with fake Great Pyramid correlations. Both the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory contend that the Great Pyramid was built to tell us something. That is an unsubstantiated presupposition. The sad truth is, both of these flawed Great Pyramid correlation without causation theories just make that idea up. Both the biblical correlation theory and the Orion correlation theory contend Great Pyramid correlations are, by definition, valid no matter what. In other words, they contend that there is no need to validate a perceived Great Pyramid correlation because, being a Great Pyramid correlation, its validity is self-evident. It is fun to encounter people with this flawed mindset. I ask Orion correlation theory believers if the precise Great Pyramid Bible correlations are valid. No coherent explanation is forthcoming. Only frustration and anger is exhibited because my question addresses research methods which correlation believers are very ill-equipped to discuss. Instead of understanding valid research techniques and rejecting made-up fake Great Pyramid correlations, people who believe these logical fallacies contend that Great Pyramid correlations are self-evident. They proclaim, Don't you just see them? Many people see the Great Pyramid Bible correlations too. Is seeing correlations a valid research method? No, it is not. Just to let you know, Great Pyramid correlations are not evidence. There is no direct physical evidence at the Giza Plateau that is a correlation. You can touch a Great Pyramid casing stone or the coffer in the King's Chamber, both of which are direct physical evidence. You can't go there and touch a correlation. Correlations are not evidence. Correlations are interpretations of evidence. Great Pyramid correlations are not evidence. They are an explanation of evidence that someone has come up with. Therefore, as interpretations or explanations of evidence, correlations that are perceived or that someone makes up are open for discussion or analysis. Aspects of perceived correlations can be examined, including the research methods used to come with perceived correlations. When the method used to come up with a perceived correlation is flawed, you can rest assured that the results of flawed research methods is logical fallacies. That is why real researchers are trained to avoid flawed research methods. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers contend the Great Pyramid was built to encode so much mathematical and esoteric information. These people get wide eyed and tell me that pi is encoded in the Great Pyramid. They proclaim that the builders of the Great Pyramid knew pi and wanted to tell us this in a profoundly symbolic way. I try to keep from laughing and say, cool. My pencil on my desk has encoded so much mathematical information in it. Shazam! My pencil has pi encoded in it. The purpose of my pencil on my desk is to tell us the builders knew pi. Profound. If you think that the builders of the Great Pyramid encoded pi into the design of the Great Pyramid to tell us something, that is your business. But that doesn't mean the Great Pyramid's purpose was to tell us the builders knew pi so we could comprehend that symbolic profundity. My bicycle exhibits pi. Did the builders of my bicycle encode pi into the design of my bicycle to tell me something? The wheels go around. Do the wheels represent the rotation of the earth symbolically? There are two wheels. Does that somehow symbolically represent the duality of our existence? I can make up fake symbolic interpretations for the bicycle just as well as anyone can make up fake, unsubstantiated, symbolic interpretations of the Great Pyramid. It is called making up correlations without causation, and it is a foundational but invalid research method embraced by the Orion correlation theory. Let's do this. Why don't we raise, let's say, $40 billion? We can make a big structure that encodes pi into it so the $40 billion structure can tell people 10,000 years from now that we knew pi. We can tell them that we knew pi in this profoundly symbolic way. But the reality is doing something like that would be stupid. Everybody knows that. Just to let you know, it would also be stupid for the builders of the Great Pyramid to do such a stupid thing. Spoiler alert, the builders of the Great Pyramid didn't care about us so much to motivate them to go to the trouble to build the Great Pyramid to tell us they knew pi. The builders did not do that because they were not stupid. One of my favorite examples of a bad research method used by Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers is to draw lines on an image and then proclaim the lines drawn on the image are profound or significant or profoundly significant or significantly profound. Usually the made-up line is considered significant when the made-up line precisely points to something. This invalid research method is extensively used regarding vents and stars or the other pyramids or anything else the line drawer wants. Now that everyone has a computer and photo editing software, this very poor research method is being used a lot. Everyone and their dog who embrace this poor research method are drawing lines. But remember, in the realm of actual, real research, precision in math does not validate a correlation. Also, in the realm of actual, real research, something pointing to something does not validate a correlation. This also applies just as much with lines. If a line precisely lines up with something, it means nothing. Precise lines or circles or spirals drawn on an image means nothing, no matter how precise the lines line up. The correlations at spuriouscorrelations.com all have graphs showing the precision of the correlations, yet the correlations lack causation and are false. So, precise lines are a poor research method used extensively in the Orion correlation theory by people who embrace unacceptable research methods to come up with logical fallacies and falsehoods. As you can see, the advantage of using poor research methods is that you can come up with anything you want. If there is some type of correlation without causation you want to embrace, or a logical fallacy you want to believe in, it is easy to justify your belief system using invalid research methods. But using poor research methods to justify a logical fallacy is a very poor research method. No wonder people who believe the Orion correlation theory don't understand and don't want to understand or don't want to talk about research at all. This use of invalid research methods is why the Orion correlation theory will never be accepted by legitimate academic scholars. The Orion correlation theory is not being rejected because the correlations are not precise. The Orion correlation theory is rejected because the precise correlations were conjured up using invalid research methods. Here is yet another very poor research method embraced by the Orion correlation theory and its believers. They say there are just so many Great Pyramid correlations that they must all be true. What, Harley? I agree. That is the most boneheaded and outrageously flawed research method that it takes my breath away. Coming up with a whole bunch of logical fallacies does not somehow validate all of those logical fallacies. It amazes me that I actually have to point this out. I am actually writing a magazine article about the precise correlations between the Great Pyramid and Elvis Presley. It is not hard at all to come up with precise correlations comparing these things because for this article, I am using the same flawed research methods used by both the Orion correlation theory and the biblical correlation theory. I cherry pick data points and compare things that have nothing to do with each other. I fiddle with the numbers and pick out a unit of measure that makes the math look good, and shazam! It's a correlation between the Great Pyramid and Elvis. I use the false notion that precision or math validate a correlation as I conjure up many Great Pyramid Elvis correlations without causation. If you believe the concept, because there are so many correlations, they all must be true, is a valid research method, then how many Great Pyramid Elvis Presley correlations does it take to make all of those correlations without causation valid? No coherent answer is ever provided by Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers to that question. I have made up a bunch of Great Pyramid Elvis correlations. It is easy to do using flawed research methods. Here is another thing to consider. The biblical correlation theory, also known as pyramidology, has many more precise correlations than the Orion correlation theory. So, if you believe the false idea that the sheer number of perceived made up Great Pyramid correlations somehow validates these correlations without causation, then the biblical correlation theory with more made up correlations is more valid than the Orion correlation theory. Just because a bunch of fake Great Pyramid correlations have been conjured up using very poor research methods, it does not mean that all of the fake Great Pyramid correlations are valid, because there are so many fake Great Pyramid correlations. Another very poor research method used by the Orion correlation theory is that they think if something looks like something else, then there must be some intended relationship between the two things being compared, like comparing the Valley of the Nile with the Milky Way, or comparing some random multiple pyramid formation with some random star pattern in the sky. That is like comparing a dog with a cloud that looks like a dog and contending that the correlation was intended to be significant by either the dog or the cloud or both. Because something looks like something doesn't mean there is any intended relationship between the things that look like each other. There are so many examples of these false comparisons that it is literally bizarre. What these visual correlations lack is some sort of real corroborative evidence that provides proof the correlation was intended or is validated by causation. No wonder the Orion correlation theory does not want to understand or use causation. It would cramp their style in coming up with logical fallacies. Making up fake Great Pyramid correlations without causation is easy, but establishing the validity of those correlations requires causation. Causation has been an elusive and non-existent aspect in the contrived correlations of the Orion correlation theory. A wonderful way to establish this fact is to ask about causation, but Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers do not understand or care about the concept of causation. Plus, they can't discuss causation because causation has to do with research techniques, and they are forbidden to discuss that subject. Just because someone thinks there is a correlation between things that look like each other doesn't make it valid. Again, what is lacking is the use of valid research methods. Having causation that is relevant and valid is a vital aspect of validating a perceived correlation. But Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers have no interest in what causation is or why it matters. Their eyes glass over when discussing this vital aspect of valid research methods. Yet, a good way to get at the causation issue is to ask the following question. Asking this question is a great method to try to compel a Great Pyramid correlation without causation believer into discussing the concept of causation without using the word causation. Here is the question. Is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid that indicates the builders intended any perceived correlation to have any significance? Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers will tell you the Great Pyramid correlations are precise, or math validates the correlation, or they will use circular reasoning, or they will just say something else looks like something else if you squint your eyes just right. But you have to really press them and hold their feet to the fire and ask for an actual answer to the question. Then they will tell you about stars or configurations or multiple pyramids or religion or the Book of the Dead or Thrawn or the Nephilim or giants or gods or the Pharaoh War or the Sphinx. But none of these things are features that are specific to the Great Pyramid. So it is an excellent question to ask, but if you are looking for a coherent answer, you won't get one. Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers are unable to provide a coherent answer because the question addresses issues relating to the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory, and that subject is forbidden for them to discuss. Harley, silence your phone. We are taping here. Now, where was I? What, Harley? We have another caller? Can such a thing even be possible? Harley, we are not taking callers right now. We are taping a YouTube video for our YouTube channel. Take a message and get back to them. What? The caller says he believes the Great Pyramid correlations without causation made up by modern people are valid? So what, Harley? Those people are a dime a dozen and they're swarming around like cockroaches. Let's get back to the video. What? What'd you say, Harley? Harley says the caller believes Great Pyramid correlations without causation, but he actually wants to discuss research methods. You've got to be kidding, Harley. He wants to discuss research methods, and he believes the fake Great Pyramid correlations without causation are valid? Well, this is amazing. We must interview him right now before he changes his mind. Patch him through to my phone, and I will interview him right now. What? It's a video call? That's even better. Patch the feed onto the screen right now, Harley. We have a live one here, and I don't want him to get away. I am sure this impromptu interview will be a true edification to our viewers. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing live a person who believes the made-up fake Great Pyramid correlations without causation and also wants to actually discuss the research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. This type of interview has never been done before. Wow, this will be an exciting, exclusive interview. I can hardly wait. Okay, it's coming on the screen now. Thank you so much for calling in, sir. I want you to know that this is such a wonderful opportunity. I hope we can have a great interview. I will ask you some questions I have asked hundreds of Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers, starting with, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? Uh-oh, no coherent answer is forthcoming. Let's try this. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalidated? Uh-oh, no answer. Harley, you said he wanted to talk. Well, how about this? Can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? No answer again. Okay, how about this? How is a Great Pyramid correlation validated? Surely you can respond to this question. Is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any perceived correlation to have any significance? Hey man, are you okay? Dude, you don't look very good. Ooh, yuck! That was disgusting. Hey Hartley, cut the feed. I guess he is nothing special. And just like all the rest of the Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers, and would rather end up cratering his cranium instead of having a coherent conversation about research methods. Harley, be glad he was not in the studio because you would have had to clean that up. The Great Pyramid Bible correlations are precise and numerous. This theory was tremendously popular, yet it too faced a specific event that put the biblical correlation theory into chaos, which resulted in the rejection of this specific correlation theory. That pivotal event was people actually examined the research methods used to come up with these precise yet invalid Great Pyramid Bible correlations. It was discovered that these Great Pyramid Bible correlations were derived using very poor research techniques. These same poor research techniques were also used by phrenology. The Great Pyramid is a complex structure with many features. Let's call those features data points. The Bible is a complex document with many features. Let's call those features data points. Proponents of the biblical correlation theory used a poor research technique called cherry picking and just cherry picked unrelated data points from the Bible and the Great Pyramid to come up with a perceived correlation without causation. Even without causation, they simply said, Shazam! It's a correlation. Usually, regarding correlation without causation theories, some correlation is discovered and its validity is often somehow based on precision. But in the realm of legitimate academic research, precision does not validate a correlation. That is contrary to the flawed research methods used in correlation without causation theories. But the reality is that precision does not validate a correlation. If you think that precision validates a correlation, go to the link below. There you will find many precise correlations, like the correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and films Nicolas Cage appeared in. These correlations are precise, yet there is no causation, so everyone knows that the correlation is invalid, except people who embrace various correlation theories. Well, 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 that caller was a wonderful object lesson. It seems that all Great Pyramid correlation without causation believers would rather have their head explode than discuss the flawed research methods used by the Orion correlation theory. One last point to be made. The use of poor research techniques results in a belief system that is like a religion. Although I am going to make a video dedicated to this concept that poor research methods produce not just logical fallacies, but those logical fallacies are codified into a type of religion. This de-evolution into a religion or mystery religion is very prevalent in correlation theories. Pyramidology, also known as the biblical correlation theory, uses poor research methods, and the result is a religious belief system. Phrenology, also known as the bump correlation theory, is also guilty of using poor research methods. In the realm of legitimate academic research, phrenology has been resoundingly rejected because this science's correlations are false, derived using poor research methods. The only way to embrace the rejected science of phrenology now is to embrace it as a tenet of some sort of a flawed mystery religion. The Orion correlation theory, which uses the same profoundly flawed research methods as the other two correlation theories of phrenology, known as the bump correlation theory, and pyramidology, also known as the biblical correlation theory, is in crisis. The crisis is in the recognition that the research methods of the Orion correlation theory are hopelessly flawed. This is why the Orion correlation theory is currently de-evolving into a mystery religion. The use of poor research methods is the reason the Orion correlation theory mystery religion will never be accepted by legitimate scholars. The quote on the screen is relevant in regards to the Orion correlation theory mystery religion because the Orion correlation theory mystery religion uses extremely low standards of evidence. I will flesh out the concept of the Orion correlation theory being just a modern day mystery religion in another video dedicated to that specific subject. I just touch on it here to wet your whistle. So don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. By the time you watch this video, the Orion correlation theory is a religion video may be already posted. For those who are still watching, if any, I am the author of 2 books. The titles are on the screen. Both are available in softcover or Kindle ebook format. I have also produced 2 documentaries available from Amazon in DVD format. The titles are on the screens. Clickable links for the 2 books and 2 documentaries are in the description. I have been on over 130 radio talk shows discussing my books, documentaries, and research associated with how and why the Great Pyramid water pump was assembled. I hope you watch the documentaries and read my books. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and watch my other YouTube videos. A lot is going on, so visit my website at www.thepump.org. You can contact me through email if you have a question or if you want me to be a guest on your show. Also, like and follow me on Facebook. You will be glad you did. Thank you, Harley, for your help in the control booth. You kept things in control. For that, I am forever indebted. May your research be valid and your research techniques legitimate. I wish you all a good night. Thank you.